Okay. Please confirm if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay. All right. So, for this week, we would continue with JavaScript. From last week, we talked about a couple of new concepts. We introduced ourselves to JavaScript, saying it's the first programming language we'll be learning on this web design class. Then we talked about data types and variables, and then conditions, and some of the tasks or projects we did. Uh, we learned how to print out items on our console, which is another way we can debug um, errors or problems in coding. So whenever you hear bug in programming, it means an error. It could be a very small error, it could be a very big error. But bugs um, are referred to as errors in your coding, right? And console is a good way of debugging because it helps you locate where you're having issues. All right. So we talked about a couple of data types. Talked of numbers, strings, and the rest of them, which were primitive data types. And then we went on to discuss the non-primitive data types, which we said are made up of or are dependent on the primitive data types, right? Because they are not like original. They are not originally data types. They were made for in order for us to easily structure our data. That's why the non-primitive data types are made. And the types of primitive, non-primitive data types are the arrays and also the objects. An example, this example here is an array where we said you know an array by the square brackets, and then each of the items inside that array should be separated with a comma. Okay, and then all we are doing here is we're using the equal to sign to assign this value, which is the array, to assign this value into this variable numbers. So this is what we discussed about last week, and we talked about a couple of methods for strings and arrays and the rest of them. So for this week, which is today and tomorrow, we would be talking about iteration first. So then after iteration, we'll go to functions and built-in functions, and then we'll talk about DOM. So iteration basically is repetition. So in programming or in real life, there might be times you want to carry out a particular task, the same task, probably repeatedly, a couple of times, maybe 5 times, 10 times. An example of that would be, say, if I ask you to print out 1 to 5 in your console, all you do is this console.log 1, right? So you say console.log 3, 4, and 5. So with this line of code, you've been able to write a programming language that prints out from 1 to 5. And so if I go to my browser here and to look at our console, so you see 1 to 5 printed out here. So for now, we are using the console to show our right. So when we get to DOM and DOM manipulation, we'll see how instead of putting those things in the console, we can put them here on our main screen. But for now, let's just focus on the console. Okay, so with the line of code we just talked about, let me look for a way to share let me share this into two. Okay, so you can see them side by side. All right. So with this line of code here, we've been able to print 1 to 5. So you can see that it is to print 1 to 5 on our console. That's perfect. So what if you were asked to print from 1 down to 100 or 1000, right? So that means it will take you a long time to start writing this code one after the other. Console.log 1 down to console.log 100, right? So it's taking so much time. So you find that you're taking up to 30 minutes or 20 minutes for a simple task, which is just to print something on the console. So that's where iteration comes about, repetition or loops. So every programming language has iteration. The only difference is the syntax, which is the way it is written in that programming language. So for JavaScript, the way we write loops or iteration will be different from the way a Python developer would write its own, as well as a C# developer, right? So let's see how we can easily repeat this line of code, right? So um, I would go to, okay, the 6 loops. So the small theory here says most of the activities we do in life are full of repetitions. Imagine if I ask you to print out from 0 to 100 using console.log. To implement this simple task, it may take you 2 to 5 minutes. Such kind of tedious repetitive tasks can be carried out using loop, which is what we are going to see now. So how do you make a loop in JavaScript, right? So this here is the structure, right? This is the structure for making loop. So this first line is a comment, which means it doesn't have any effect on the computer, or the computer doesn't see it. It's just for you to understand, right? So where it starts from is this for keyword. Know that you want to write a loop here, a loop code, a should I say a statement that repeats a particular line of code for as long as you wish it to occur, right? So the very first thing is to write your for keyword, and then after your for, so in our JavaScript, in our script.js file, we'll write for, right? Then after that, you have your parentheses. So inside the parentheses, there are 3 important things that go inside there, right? And from this documentation, it says the first one should be an initialization. So you need to have a starting point for your loop, all right? So just like you want to print from 0 or from 1 to 5, it means your starting point is 1, right? So that has to be your initialization. So you have to initialize a variable to have a starting point first. Okay, so please don't mix it up. You have to initialize a variable. So which means you have to create a variable and give it a starting position or a starting point. And this starting point is not fixed. It is based on the particular problem you're trying to solve at that moment. So for this one, we are trying to print from 1 to 5. So it is obvious that the starting point should be from 1, right? So let's see how we initialize the variable and give it a starting point. So because the first alphabet initialization is I, you find out that most codes you see that has to do with loop, the initialization is the variable they use is I to represent initialization. So which means here we can say let I be equal to 0, or for this case 1, because we are taking our starting position from 1. So here I've initialized a variable and I've assigned a value of 1 to it. So which means 1 should be our starting point. So that is for initialization. Secondly is the condition. So remember when we did conditional rendering, which is the if statement, right? We said the if block would run so long as its condition is true. So over here, it will keep testing this condition to make sure that this condition is true. So every time the condition is true, it will repeat that line of code you want it to repeat. Okay, so this condition might not be clear to you until we are done with the entire line of code. Then we can go over it again so you can see, you can now grab the concept properly. But for now, I need you to understand that after your initialization, the next thing that comes in is your condition for which you want this code to keep repeating. So for this, I want to repeat, and this condition should be based on this variable you initialize here, right? So I want to repeat this line of code so long as the value of I is equal to or greater than 5, right? Or less than 5, rather. So I would say I less than or equal to 5, right? So I wanted to keep repeating every time you find out that I is greater than, is less than or equal to 5. So if this condition is true for each repetition, it will keep running. So lastly is your increment or decrement. So we want to increase from 1 to 5. So we want to increase this I variable from 1 to 5. And as we're increasing it, we want to print the value out. So this is what we have to consider for us to get this properly. So the last one will now be the increment. So I can say increase I to be equal to I plus 1. So what this means is that for the next repetition, the current value of I, increase it by 1, assign that value to I. So which means you're like substituting the former value of I. I will go over. So with this here, we've been able to do the initialization, the condition, then the increments. Here it says increment or decrement based on what you're trying to solve, right? You either increment or you decrease. Okay. So once you're done with this parenthesis, the next thing is your block, your curly brackets. So whatever it is between the opening and closed curly brackets, that is the operation you want to carry out. Right? That is what you want. You want to repeatedly carry out. So here I'm going to start with my curly brackets, and inside here I would now say I want to console dot log. Let's see 1 for now. Okay, let's say 1 for now. Okay, this should be semicolon and not comma. Okay, so when I do this, let me take this off here. So we only have our loop, our code for looping. Okay, just to test it, let's see what we get now. Okay, so on running our code, what we get now is, let me try to zoom in so you can see this. Okay, so After writing this loop code here, what we now have is we have 1 printed out. But now beside it, you have this 5 that has a brown background or a gray background, right? So what this means is that it is printing out 1 5 times. So in other words, what is happening here is that it is repeating this line of code 5 times. Why is it repeating this 5 times? So let's explain them one by one. So starting from here, we said we are initializing a variable to a certain point of 1. So it means for the first iteration, like I said before, iteration means repetition. All right, so it can be interchange between iteration, loop, or repetition, right? So if you hear me talking about loop, it's the same thing as iteration or repetition. So now for the first iteration, we have that our variable I is equal to 1, right? So JavaScript will start from here and say, okay, we've initialized a variable I and we've given it a value of 1. So it will now go on to the next side, which is condition to test if the current value of I is less than or is equal to 5. So we can decide to remove equal to, it should just be less than, right? Based on what you're trying to solve. But for now, we are using less than or equal to 5. So which means if I is less than 5, it means the condition is true. And also, if it is equal to 5, the condition is also true. But once I is more than 5, then the condition can no longer be true. So for the first loop or the first iteration, where we have I to be equal to 1, what it does is that it tests this condition to check if the current value of I is less than or equal to 5. And right now, I is equal to 1, which means it is less than 5, right? So good. Since it is less than 5, it will now come to this next side, right? And increase the value of I from 1. Okay, remember I is 1 right now. So what it does here is it will increase the value of this I by 1 and then assign it to I back. So it's like increasing the value of the initial value of I by 1. So I will now be 2. So once it does that, it will now print out this code. It will now print out the first one, right? So once I is 1, what it does is that it prints 1 to our console. Then it comes down. So now when it now go back here again to continue. But now when it's going for the next loop, it no longer considers this part anymore, right? It now skip this part completely. But it remember that over here you've increased the value of I from 1, you've increased it to 2. So I is now equal to 2. So now it will now test this condition again to see if I still maintains the proper condition. And I being 2 now is still less than 5. So long as it makes it through, it will run this line again by printing another one to our console. Okay, and then it increases the value again. So each time it is iterating, it is increasing the value of I by 1. So with each repetition, it keeps increasing. So after it increases this one by 1, it now goes down here. So since it has increased it by 1, I will now become 3. So it will now come here again to test. I is still less than 5. So again, it prints out 1. Right? Then it increases the value again. So now we have I to be equal to 4. So 4 is still less than 5. So it prints again. It prints another 1. So it now increases the value again to 5. So when it increases the value of I to 5, it will now test this condition again. So now 5 is not less than 5, but it is equal to 5. So which means this condition is still true because the condition we are using here is that the value of I should be less than or equal to 5. Because the value of I right now is 5, this condition is still true. So it will continue by increasing I by 1, and then it will print this again. It will now print another 1. So now, since it has increased the value of I from 5, it has increased it to 6. It will now test this loop. It will now test this condition again. Is the current value of I still less than or equal to 5? And you know 6 is greater than 5. So it now takes this condition to be false. So because this is now false, it stops the loop. It no longer increments the value of I here. It no longer prints out this. So it stops here. So we have 1 printed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's why you see 1 printed out here. And over here, you see 5 times, telling you that it has repeated, it has printed 1 5 times on your console. So we are supposed to see one down in each row, right? But because it is the same thing is printing out, it just does it there and shows you how many times it has repeated. Okay, so this is how you repeat code. But from what we are trying to solve, we are trying to print from 1 to 5, not from 1 to, not just 1 with each loop. Okay, but do you get this? Does this idea or this explanation make sense before I continue to make it a little bit
Yes,
complicated?
this in fact I even have to be jotting it down so that I can be able to follow through. Because since this one is quite different from where we are coming from. Though it's looking interesting actually, but okay, these prints, the way they are appearing, are you the one putting the prints there or is the one bringing it up, those comments by itself?
Yeah, I'm the one writing them. I'm just showing. I'm
Oh,
just showing what it prints with each iteration, each loop, what it prints each time.
okay. Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
Continue. We
Okay.
are still in sync.
Okay. If there's any question, you can feel free to ask. Okay. So currently, what this line of code does now is that it prints 1 every time. But that is not what we want. What we want instead is to print from 1 to 5. And so if you notice, with each loop, right? With each loop, we have the value of I to be 1. For the second loop, the value of I is 2. For the next loop, the value of I is 3. So which means here in this console.log, instead of printing 1 every time, if we instead change 1 to I, which I, it means we'll be able to get 1 to be printed for the first iteration. And when I is 2, it will print out 2. And when I is 3, it will print out 3. When I is 4, it will print out 4. And when it is 5, it prints out 5. So if instead of before, no, we had coded this to print just 1. So it means if I change 1 to 2, let me comment these other ones so we don't get an error on our code. So if I change 1 to 2, we'll now have 2 printed on our console every time, right? So it means based on what you put here, if it is 5, that is what will be repeated 5 times. So now, if I change it to the variable I, okay, and you know that the value of I is increasing 1 with each iteration. So with each iteration, it is increasing by 1, then you know that it means you can get from 1 to 5 printed on your console. So with just that small modification, if I now save this code, you now see it printing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because when it starts from the very beginning, right, by initializing I to by 1. Okay, so sorry, can you see my screen? Okay, okay,
Yes, I can see it.
okay. So when the code starts from the beginning, the initial value of I is 1, right? So on testing this condition is true. So it now increases I to 2 for the next loop. So but for that particular loop, the value of I is 1. So this line here prints that value of I 1. Then it now goes to repeat itself again. So but when it's going to repeat itself again, because of this increment here, it has now been increased from 1 to 2. So that's why with each loop, the value of I changes. So instead of incrementing, if the problem you're trying to solve is decreasing the value, all you have to do here is change the value of, change it from plus to minus. But be careful now, because if we if you change this condition, this increments to decrements, it means after the first iteration, the value of 1 will now be 0, right? Because 1 minus 1 is 0. Then when it does that iteration, it goes to the next one. It will now do 0 minus 1, which will give you minus 1. So it means you will keep getting values that are less than 5. So it means this condition will forever, for infinity, be smaller than 5. So it means this loop will keep running and running and running repeatedly until your laptop crashes, and then you have to restart your laptop. So you have to be mindful of the condition you give and the increments or decrements. You have to be mindful. For laptops that are strong, you probably will not have that issue of freezing. Probably you just have to change the code and restart your server, right? So you change these values based on what you want to get. So for now, I'll still leave it at plus, because that's what you're trying to solve. So this line of code, as we've seen, would forever print 1 to 5. So it means if I want to print from 1 to 100, I can also use this line of code. All I have to do is change this value from 5. All I have to do is change it from 5 to 100. Uh, Sorry, give me a minute. My system seems to be on. There you go. Okay, so if we want to print from 1 to 100 or 1 to 1000, right? All we have to do is change this value. So let's start little. Let's say from 1 to 10. So now I'm increasing from 1 to 5. I'm not just printing from 1 to 5, but I'm printing from 1 to 10. So on saving this line of code, you have in your console, you can see that in your console we have 1 to 10 printed out. So with just this few line of code, you can print from 1 to 1 million as much as you want, right? So all you have to do is few seconds of code, and you have um, a repetition. So you might not really see how complex the complex situations this loop can fix right now, because all we are doing is printing from 1 to 10. But there would there will definitely be situations in projects where you have to carry out a very serious operation, and you need it to repeat itself, because you can't do it on your own. So with this idea, you can just do a loop and then put in that operation to just continue so long as a condition is met. And this here is how you print from 1 to 10. So if you want to print from 1 to 20, you know all you have to do is change this value. So, but somebody else can decide to write this code like this. So instead of starting from 0, let me comment this one out. So instead of starting from 1, like we started in our first solution, you might see somebody else starting from 0, right? So now what it means is if you continue with this and let's say it's, you see that you'll be printing from 0 to 10. So it means you have to adjust a couple of things. Firstly, you have to adjust, you don't want 0. You don't want 0 to be printed out. So it means instead of printing out just I, you should add 1 to it. So if you add 1, it means instead of having 0 for the first one, it will now be 0 plus 1, which is 1. Right? For the next one, instead of having 1, it will now be 1 plus 1, which is 2. So let me save this here. So when I save this, you now see there's still something we have to fix. For now, you see that we are printing our operation is starting from 1, which is what we want. So it is now printing from 1 to 11. We don't want 11. What we want is 10. Okay. So why is it printing 11? It is printing 11 because of our condition here. All right. Because of our condition. So the condition says so long as I is less than or equal to 10, this operation should be carried out. So at the last point when I is equal to 10, when it has repeated this code 10 times and I is now equal to 10, because 10 is equal to 10, so it makes this condition true. So when it is now printing out here, it will now be 10 plus 1 to give us 11. So we don't want that. So instead, we can say, okay, let's reduce this condition to be only when it is less than 10. So it takes out when I is equal to 10 from the loop. So when I is now 9, all you have to do is increase 9 by 1, and then you have 10. So instead of this line of code we used before, somebody else can create the same operation using this line of code. It doesn't mean anyone is better than the other. All right. It doesn't mean anyone is better than the other. It's based on how best you understand a problem. That's how you fix. That's how you solve it. So it doesn't matter if you use this method or you use this method. Either of them is fine. So I would like to take your question before I continue on here. Is there anything that's still not very clear? I need me to go over it again.
Just that the second method you just explained, I was trying to figure out where the numbers that made it 11 was, and just because the code doesn't look different from the. Or did you understand my question, sir?
Okay, I understand your question. Okay, let's
There's no
let's
more
do it.
difference.
Let's
Okay.
okay. Let's do the process again from the starting, right? So for this second code, let's see the difference first. So for this second code, we are initializing our I to be 0, right? But from the first one, we are initializing the I to be 1. That's first. And secondly, the condition here is that as long as I is less than 10. But the condition here is that as long as I is less than or equal to 10. And then the operation we are carrying out here is to print out the value of I. But here, we're not just printing out the value of I, but we are adding 1 to the value of I and printing out that value. Okay, so let's see what happens at the first iteration. At the first iteration, when I is equal to 0, right? This condition is true. 0 is less than 10. So it prints out when I is 0, it's over here. It will print 0 plus 1. So it will print out 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. So for the second iteration, it has increased the value of I by 1 to 1 from 0 to 1, sorry. Okay, so now the value of I at that point is still less than 10, so it prints 1 plus 1, which is 2, right? So it continues like this. Sorry. It keeps doing this repeatedly until it gets to I equal to 9. When it gets to this point, it checks the value of I, which is 9. Is it less than 10? Yes, it is less than 10. So it means, since this is true, it means it does 9 plus 1 by printing out 10 here for you. Okay, so it goes to the next loop where I is now equal to 10. So once I becomes 10, this condition now becomes false. So which means it no longer increments the I and it no longer prints out this, because we've removed the equal to. But if this value was I less than or equal to 10, and I was 10 at this point, like we did before, what will happen here is, because this condition will now be true for this case, it will now increase the value of I and also print out 10 plus 1, which here now we now print 11 to our console and go to the next iteration with I being equal to 11. So this is when it will now check is 11 less than or equal to 10. It will now give it false here. Then it will now break this loop. So that is why we are having 10 printed out before, until we had to remove this equal to sign. Then it gave us what we expected of it as printing out from 1 to 10 for us here. So does this do justice to your question?
Okay. All right, sir.
Okay, okay, okay. So this is an easy way of using loops. All right. So sometimes, so it means here, instead of increasing by 1, if you change this by 1 to 2, it means it will increase each of I value you have by 2. So it means for the first iteration, when I is 0, it will carry out the code, and then it will increase I from 0 to not 1, but increase it to 2. So you're like skipping 1 point. So if we save this, let's see what will get printed out on our console. So on incrementing by 2, what we are doing is, for the first iteration when I is 0, right? It checks if this condition is true. Yes, it is true. It now increase I by 2 and print out I plus 1, which is 1. So it now go to the next iteration when I is no longer 0. It is now 2, because we increase by 2 over here. So here it will now check again. Is the condition still true? Yes, it is still true. So it now carry out console.log I plus 1, which is 2 plus 1, and that is 3, right? If you increase the value again by 2, so now I will now be equal to 5. Okay, so that's why you have 1, 3, 5, 9 printed out here. So these values here are based on what you hope to achieve with your line of code. It is not just static or fixed. So based on the problem you're trying to solve, you have to change the values accordingly. So let's just see one other problem before we go. Um, okay, let me uh, let me take out this code and let's see what this code hopes to solve. Okay, so let me explain this code. So over here, what we have is firstly of countries, which is Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland in an array. So we have an array of strings, right? And then we are saving this array into this variable countries, which we call countries. Remember, we created the variable using const, so it is a constant, which means we can no longer be able to change the value of countries. Okay, that's the first step. Then it will now come to this next line, and in this next line, what we are doing is we are creating an empty array, and then we are assigning the value of that empty array into this variable called new array. Okay, so we are doing this because of how we want to carry out our solution. So once we do this, the next thing now is the loop. So what this loop is doing is that we have our for keyword here, saying signifying that we want to loop here, and here we have our initialization, initializing I to 0. Okay, so the next is a condition that we are considering. And the condition is that I is less than countries dot length. And remember, countries is this array here. Okay. And dot length is an array method we discussed about last week that we said it gives you the total item inside your array. And over here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it means over here, to us, we are saying countries dot length, but to the computer, all it is saying here is 5 because it has 5 items inside here. So the condition here is that as long as the value of this variable I is less than 5, this loop, this operation should continue to be done. Okay, and then it is increasing the value of I here by 1. So this thing they wrote here, I plus plus, is the same as what we did before as I equal to I plus 1. So it's just that for beginners, you might not be able to look at this and understand it. But this is more descriptive to you, and that's why we use this. So instead of this, you can use this also. It is still fine. So we've done our initialization, we've done our condition, and we've done our increment. So now, what is the operation that we want to be carried out? So what we want is that we want to check countries brackets I. Remember, for each loop, I will change based on this value. So for the first loop, I will be 0. So what we'll be having is countries square brackets 0. And remember from last week, we said when you have this, this means the item at this particular index position, which means the first position. So the item at this first position is Finland. Okay, so that is what you take here. If you now take Finland, then dot to uppercase. We also talked about this last week, and we said this is a string method for converting a string to uppercase. So it means what's this line of code does, what's this side I highlighted now, not the entire line, just this part I highlighted. What it does is that it goes into countries at the particular index of 0, and it takes that item. Because it is a string, it now converts the item to uppercase. So over here, it now converts Finland to capital Finland. So when it does, it will now use push, which is a method we also talked about last week. which adds item to the ending of an array. So since it has converted Finland from capitalized from here to uppercase, it will now store Finland into new array, which is this empty one we created for the first iteration. So it means for the first iteration, new array would now be like this: Finland, Finland, right? So it now go to the next iteration by increasing I by 1, and now repeats the same thing again. So now we now have countries square brackets 1. So the item at this position is Sweden. So it will now convert it to uppercase and push it to our array. So remember, in our array, we already have Finland first. So and push adds to the ending. So it will now be Finland, comma, Sweden, like this for the second iteration. So for the next iteration, it will increase I from 2 to 3. So we now have countries, square bracket 3, and it keeps repeating this line until the condition is no longer true. So we now have Sweden and then Denmark. So it will keep increasing until I is when I is now 4. Okay, let's say I is now 5, right? We have 0, 1. Oh, sorry, this is 2. I made mistake there. So it will keep increasing until when I is now 4, right? Remember, the index for the item at index 4 is since it's 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. It will convert this to Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and now Iceland. Because I, which is 4 currently, is less than the countries of length, which is 5. So once this is done, it will now increase the value again by 1 to make it 5. But now, once it takes this condition that countries.length, that I should be less than countries.length, and right now I is 5. 5 is no longer less than the current value of countries.length. So this becomes false. So it no longer carries out this operation. All right. So it stops here. So you now have new array to be this. Okay. So, but this is all we have. And if I save this now, if I save this and we wait for our browser to refresh, you see that nothing is printed out on your console because you're not printing out anything on your console. So it doesn't change the fact that it has done all of these operations and we now have a new value inside new array. So it means after the loop, we can come outside of the loop and then say, let's console.log new array. And I save this. So once I save this here, you now see this printed out on your console, showing us an array of 5 items. And inside of that 5 items, we have all our countries, all in uppercase now. So what we did with this kind of code is that we mapped or we looked through this array, one through the items of the array, one after the other, converting each of them to uppercase and then printing it out on our console. So that is what this line of code does for you. So is this clear, or there's something that's not really clear on this explanation here? So I can go over it again. Okay, so I'll take the silence to mean there is no question on that so far. Okay, so you can see how loop can be used to operate. So all you have to remember is that for loop, you have to first make the initialization here, and then after the initialization, you have to create a condition for which your loop has to run repeatedly, and after which you have to increment that variable so your loop has to keep going. Because if you don't increment it, it means your variable or your initialized variable will just be one value all through the entire problem. And also for this problem, notice they had to create a new array here, because if you don't create a new array, you cannot be able to exactly change this array. So they created an array where they can push in values, right? So if you don't do this, you can use splice from last week, where we said splice can be used to remove and add. So you can remove Finland and replace it by Finland that is now in uppercase, based on what you feel is best, would be the best operation. You can you can take up that. Okay, so that's basically is it for iterations. There are a couple of exercises here to go over, and also there's another type of loop called while loop. But since for loop is mostly used in JavaScript, that's what we focused on more. There are exercises over here. If we have time, we will go over them. If we don't, then probably take them as assignments so we can keep ourselves busy. Okay, so the next four is functions. So we've not been able to solve any real life project problem yet with JavaScript, because we have to get the basics, or we have to see how the basics operates, how it is carried out. We have to see the syntax. We have to know the syntax. We have to know the purpose for using a particular operation. We have to know the purpose of using a condition. We have to know the purpose of using a loop. We have to know the purpose of using an array so we can solve a particular problem that our project is giving to us for that time. So now over to a new concept. It says functions. So let me read theory here. It says so far we have seen many built-in JavaScript functions. In this section, we will focus on custom functions. What is a function? Before we start making functions, let's understand what function is and why we need function. So here it says a function is a reusable block of code or programming statements designed to perform a certain task. A function is declared by, okay, let me stop here. So let me explain what this is trying to tell us. So let's say we want to, from this code, what we are doing now is we are mapping through this array, right? And we are converting with each loop, we are converting that item from its particular case, we are converting it to uppercase. So if we now have another variable, the countries, or let me say foods, right? And let's say the first one is rice, the next is beans, and the next is, let's say, yam, right? And we want to carry out this same operation of converting it to uppercase. Okay, so it therefore means that we would need to write this line of code again. So I have to do this Control C. I'll paste this. Then here we'll now have to change this to foot.length. Then we'll now have to create a new variable, new array2. So it means we have to change this one to new array2 because new array is what is used for this one. Then we have to change this one also to foot. Okay. So now let's console.log new array2. So if I save this, let me go to my browser. Okay, so what I've done here is that the same operation I am carrying out for this one, which is converting them to uppercase and printing them out, which is what I did here, right? That is the same operation I am doing for also this array by converting them to uppercase and printing them out here. Okay, so this is good. If you can do this at a beginner level, it's amazing. It's nice. But somehow, as you progress, this begins to rub you off the wrong way. Okay, because you find out that you're repeating this line of code every time. So it means if there's another array I want to carry out the same particular function or this task, you have to now repeat this code again, repeat this one, repeat this one again. So it doesn't really make so much sense, right? So that is the idea of function. So the idea of function is that you program it to carry out a particular set of tasks. So let's say you program it to create an empty variable, right? Once it creates that variable, it then it will then carry out this loop automatically for you and then print out your value. Okay, so you've been able to so now what you do is you no longer have to keep writing these codes every time. All you have to do is call the function anytime you need it. Okay, so how do we do that? So we will not be able to create this variable inside the function for now, but we'll be able to do the remaining ones first. So let's see how we can do it. So we want to create a function that will do this part for us. So let me take off this and let me take off this. Okay, so let's create a function to do that. And from this, sorry, from why the document is loading up. From the documentation, it says for you to create a function, you need the function keyword. So just like we use for making a loop structure, we need a function keyword to declare. Like it says here, a function is declared by a function keyword followed by a name. So it means anytime you want to create a function, the first thing you write is function. It is a JavaScript keyword that lets JavaScript know that you want to create a function. All right. So that's it. So the next is followed by a parenthesis. So we have parenthesis. For now, we'll leave this parenthesis empty. As we progress, we'll see the things we can add inside and why we would add things inside. Okay, so we have a function. So after this function, we'll now have the curly brackets. So it is between this open curly brackets and this end curly brackets that will now carry out this set of operations. So I'll just copy this one. Okay, I'll cut it out and I'll place this here and I'll save. So with this, we've created a function, right, that does this particular thing. But right now, this function does not have a name. And for us to call a function, that function needs to have a name. Just like for someone to refer to you, the person has to call you by your name. Otherwise, you exist, quite all right. But if the person doesn't call you by your name, nobody knows they are trying to refer to you. So how do you give a name to your function? After writing your function keyword, over here, you now give it a descriptive name. So here I will say text to uppercase. So this is my function. This is now my function name, text to uppercase. So why I use this is because anybody that sees this function now would have an idea of what my function should be doing. Okay, so they will know that, okay, this function is supposed to convert a text to uppercase. But they probably might not know how exactly it does it, right? So when I do this, I have been able to declare a function that carries out this task. And now if I save and go to my browser, you see that nothing is printed out on our console. So you might think this is a problem, but no, it is not a problem so far. So what we've done here is that we've created the function, okay? But for it to work, you have to call it. So what we've done here is declare a function. In other words, we've created a function. But until we call a function, it doesn't work. So how do you call a function? You call a function by writing its name. And now the name of our function is text to uppercase. So down here, I will now write text to uppercase. But not just write it like this, I'll use parentheses. So if you observe properly, you notice that this is looking similar to this. And like I said in last class, to uppercase is a string method. And I said a method is a function that is tied to a particular data. So to uppercase is a function for strings that convert strings to uppercase. But this here now is a custom function we have created to go through this array and with each loop, converting the item of that array to uppercase. Okay, so now if I now save this, you can now see this printed out on our. Can you hear me? Please, can you mute your mic, Mr. Adesina? Can you please mute your mic, Mr. Adesina?
Okay, since the host can mute the, I think you can mute him. Doesn't know he's on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so on calling this function, it now carries out all of these operations. So if I just replace this code again, so it now does it 2 times. So it will keep doing it and doing it and doing it every time, right? So that is what this function does. But for us to be able to use this particular function for any type of array we want to use it for, we have to make a little bit of adjustments to it. But before I continue with those adjustments, I want to confirm first if you understand this concept before I move on. So if there's any question on this, you can ask so that we can move on.
Okay, it's still clear because it's like coming back to some of the things we taught last week, so it's still okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So now we have been able to declare a function, and we said to create a function, you use the function keyword, followed by the name you want that function to have. and then your parentheses, and inside your curly brackets is where you want whatever operations you want to carry out to be done. So that's good. But now, for us to be able to use this function on any array, because right now, this function only works for this array. It's not working for foods array. So for us to be able to do it, we have to make its operation dynamic, which means we need to make it such that it can collect values and carry out operation based on those values it has collected. And if you remember from the other thing we did, um, if you want to do this for food, there are a couple of things you have to change, and the things you have to change is this country's name. This country, you have to change countries from what it is now to food, and then this new array, you have to change it to new array 2. So that means instead of that, we can now pass in those values to this function. And for you to pass in values to a function, it is done inside this parenthesis. And we call it parameters. So when you put in anything inside this parenthesis where you declare a function, we refer to them as parameters. So let's say the first one is the name of the array. So you can say array name. That's the first value you want to take. So it means instead of writing countries, you want it to be array name, the name of the array you're passing to that function. So everywhere countries is, we'll change it to array name. Good. Then the next one is the new array we are creating. So we separate it and say array new. Right. So it means we change this new array to array new, and also we change this one to array new. So with this now, I can say this is now dynamic. The only problem now is over here where we are calling this function, we are not passing in values that it's supposed to take. Okay, because right now we are saying this function should accept two values, two parameters. First should be the name of the array that we want to loop through. Secondly, should be the array where we want it to push each of these items that's converted to packets, right? So it means when we are calling it, we have to pass in those values. So if you want this function to be carried out for countries, over here, the first thing, since the first one is array name, and the array name we want to consider for now is countries, write countries first, then comma. Then after countries, we now write the new array, which is new array. So this line of code now, we do this for countries. So if I want to, so let me save this first. Let me save this first. Okay, so you can see that we have it printed out here. It does it perfectly for country. So if I want to do the same thing for foods, all I have to do is come down here and write, carry out the function again, call the function again. But now I will now change the value. So the first one was countries, but now I want you to do for foods. And for food, it should store the variable inside new array 2. So I put new array 2. And I save this here. So you can see why this line does for Finland and for countries. This other line does for foods. So it means I can create a new array here, const that says skills, and let's say the first one is HTML, the second one is CSS, and the third one is JavaScript. Sorry, I'm doing it outside. Right? So it means if I want to carry out this particular function again for skills, all I have to do is call the function down here and change the parameters I'm passing in. So I will now pass in skills here as the name of the array. Then I'll create a new array here where it will be pushed into. So let me say new array 3. And that will be the next parameter I will put in here. So with this, the first function carries out for countries. The next one does it for foods. The next one does it for skills. So with this line of code, we've been able to dynamically carry out a particular task that converts items in an array into uppercase. And now we'll be able to do it for different arrays that were made available for us. So we don't have to keep writing this line of code repeatedly every time we want to carry out that same operation every time we want to do it. So in coding, we we usually say it is good to code dry. So when you see DRY, it's an acronym for to don't repeat yourself. So don't repeat yourself, right? This is what the acronym stands for. So don't worry about that for now, as you're just being introduced to it. You don't have to make sure your codes are not repeated. For now, it is good that you get the concept. So when you code properly and you see that you're repeating some things, then you can now revisit your code to refactor it so that you remove out every repetition, right? So that's what this code is. So instead of repeating all of this code, all you're doing is repeating the name of the function and changing each of the values. So this function is now more dynamic than what we used to have before. What we had before was fixed. It was just fixed before. It was just done for one particular function, one particular thing. But now all you have to do is change the name of the array, and you have the function carried out for you. So this here is how we create functions in JavaScript and how we can make it dynamic to carry out um, a, a particular task for us that we wanted to do. So is there any question on this so far? Okay, so I'll take that as no question. So here, what we've done is we've been able to declare a function, right, by using the function keyword and the name. And then we've been able to pass in parameters based on what we hope to achieve. So I said when you put in variables inside this attribute, inside this parentheses, in your function declaration, those values you put in there are regarded to as parameters. But when you put in values in these parentheses here, when you are calling a function, the values are referred to as arguments. So most times developers use parameter and arguments interchangeably, but you should know that the correct thing is that parameters is for when you're declaring a function, while argument is for when you're calling a function. Okay. So, and also remember, every programming language has function in it. The only difference is how it is made. In Python, the way they declare a function is they use def, then they write the function name, right? And then probably a parenthesis, and then they have this column, and they write their whatever here. So it's different syntax for different programming language, but otherwise, whenever you hear function in programming, it is the same everywhere. It is the same thing. It is reusable blocks of code that you use to carry out that are used to perform a particular task repeatedly. That's what functions are. And so based on the problem you're trying to solve, that's how you tailor your function to be. Okay. Ah. So now let's work on small adjustments here on our code. Let's work on small adjustments here on our code. So over here now, we notice that for um each of these array that we want to convert to uppercase, we are creating a new empty array here. And and aside printing out the value of that array inside this console, it doesn't have any other use outside. Okay, so this should rub you off that this is probably wrong somehow because we are repeating these things again and again and again, and it's not like there is something different happening to this that's not happening to this one or this one. Okay, so that's a problem. So how do you fix it? It means we have to take out this completely from here, and then we have to push it inside our function. Okay, so we want to say inside this function, every time you want to carry out this operation on an array, create an empty array called new array. Okay, so it means we don't need to pass in a new array attribute parameter anymore. So it should use it here, new array, new array. So over here, I'm going to move this. And I'll save this. So what is happening here now is that because you might start to ask, that doesn't it mean it is creating an a variable called new array each time for these arrays, right? Is that not supposed to be a problem? No, because when for this first line, it will carry out this particular code, right? And create this array and new array, and then it does this operation, okay? For this first one. So once it is done with this one, it will create another one for this one without any reference to the other one it has created for countries. What I mean is when it creates for countries and it goes to foods, the array it creates for food has no relationship with the array it has created for countries because you're calling this function different type. So you can see how we've been able to keep refactoring our code to make sure we remove every form of repetition we have. So right now we are not repeating anything. All we are doing is calling the function again and again as many times as we need it to be. And as you can see from our console, it is still doing what it's supposed to do the right way without any problem. So this here is now fine with us. So um like I said, you start off small, you start off low, to write your function the best way, the simplest way it should be for you to understand that code. So once you're done with writing the simple code and it fixes the problem for you, it carries out the operation you want it to do perfectly the way you want it, then you can now focus on refactoring your code to making sure that it removes every form of repetition or any form of bad coding, right? So like I said, just focus on the basics for now. Make sure you try to get the basics for now, and that's it. So lastly, about functions is return value. Return value. What is a return value? So what I'm trying to say now is this. So remember we are creating this array inside here, inside this function. So when you create a variable inside a function, you're restricting the scope of that variable, which means you cannot be able to access that variable outside this function. Remember, this function starts here and ends here. So it means I cannot come outside here and say console.log new array. So if I do this, I will now get an error on my console that says on God's reference error, new array is not defined. And it tells me to go to my scripts.js line 15. So if I go to script.js line 15, it tells me new array is not defined. Even though I can clearly see that a new array is defined here, giving a value of empty array here. And over here, we are pushing in values into it. But it is still telling me it's undefined. It is not defined. This is because this new array we've created between these curly brackets is only restricted or is only accessible inside the function text to uppercase. So I can't get it outside. So for me to get a value, it means I have to return a value from the function. So when you return a value from a function, what it does is that every time you call that function and it simplifies everything, it will push out that value so that you can access it outside. So here, instead of console.login new array, if I return new array, to return, all I have to do is write return and this, right? So if I return it, every time I now call this function, I cannot be able to store it inside a variable. So let me say let x be equal to this, right? And let me say let y be equal to this other one, and let z be equal to this. So now I now have access to the value of new array outside this by calling, if I now console.log x, so you can now see the value of new array printed out. So remember, I'm not printing out new array. What I'm doing is I'm returning this value. So in this function, when it carries out this function, it will now return the value of new array, which you can now assign into a variable outside your function. So with this now, you can now return a particular value from your function, thereby making the value accessible outside your function. So this is the idea return brings to JavaScript programming. Okay, and it's a very good and very useful idea that you get mastered with. You master very soon. but it is fine if you don't master it now. But if this is not clear, we can quickly ask your question so I can clarify every doubt and every on certain stuff here before we continue. Would there be any question on this?
None for now. It's just that I still need to
Oh,
watch the video over again.
okay. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. So I wouldn't want to teach any other thing again for today, so I don't pack too many informations because you have to digest these things properly. While we go for the next class. So I will end today's class here with everything we've spoken about. I will just go over it again. And the first thing we talked about was iteration, which I said iteration basically is repeating a particular operation as many times as you wish it to happen, right? So that's what iteration is, and we use the for keyword for doing it. And also we talked about functions, and we talked about declaring a function first, and we said you can use the function keyword to declare the function, then followed by the function name, and after that you have parentheses. So if you don't want your function to be dynamic based on taking in values in order to carry out those operations, you can leave the parentheses empty. But if you want it to take in values that you want to perform those tasks with, then you pass in parameters into it, right? So after that, then your curly brackets, which is where the operation you want to be performed goes into. And then based on if you want to return a value or not, you use the return. So not every function, it's not every time you create a function, you use the return. Sometimes you don't want to return anything. So then most times you want to return. So it depends on what you're trying to solve. Then you return a value. So that would be all. That is all we'll be discussing for today's class. Tomorrow's class would be um DOM and DOM manipulation, which is how we can all of this JavaScript code we've been trying to carry operations out on our console. We would have to see how we can now make sure we are effecting changes on our web browser, right? So not just on our console. We can now see some changes done on our web browser using JavaScript. We can now manipulate HTML or CSS codes using JavaScript. That's what Tom will expose us to. So these other concepts we'll be using are the programming basics of JavaScript. So what we'll go over with tomorrow would be how to effect or manipulate our HTML browser or whatever the user is interfacing with. That's what we'll be discussing in tomorrow's class. So I hope to see you all in tomorrow's class because we'll be going over ideas we would need to complete the project we started with HTML and CSS. So if there is no other class, I would say good night and don't stop practicing. Don't stop practicing. Just practice as much as you can. I'll see you all tomorrow.
All right, thank you.
All right.